Most people who can recite the broad outline of Gettysburg have never heard of what happened 11 days earlier, across the rolling farmland of Culpeper County, Virginia, along the banks of a river called the Rappahannock. No film has been made about it. No national park visitor center processes hundreds of thousands of guests through its grounds every year the way Gettysburg's does. And yet what unfolded there on June 9, 1863, did something that no single day of fighting at Gettysburg itself managed to do. It altered the psychological foundation on which the entire Gettysburg Campaign was built, and it came within a genuinely narrow margin of unraveling Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North before it had properly begun. The battle was called Brandy Station. It remains, to this day, the largest cavalry engagement ever fought on the North American continent. Nearly 20,000 horsemen, Union and Confederate combined, fought across those fields for almost an entire day in a contest that began as a surprise and ended as a revelation, one that changed how both armies understood themselves, and one whose consequences rippled forward through every major decision of the following month. What Brandy Station mattered against was a set of assumptions about Confederate cavalry that the Army of Northern Virginia had spent 2 years building, and the reputation of one man in particular sat directly at the center of those assumptions. James Ewell Brown Stuart, known to history simply as Jeb Stuart, was, by June of 1863, the most celebrated cavalry commander in the Confederacy and arguably in the entire war. He had ridden completely around George McClellan's army not once but twice, humiliating Union commanders in operations that generated newspaper headlines across both North and South. He dressed with a theatrical flair that matched his reputation, a plumed hat, a red-lined cape, a banjo player who traveled with his staff for entertainment around the campfire. Stuart was, in the truest sense, a celebrity general, and he had earned a substantial portion of that celebrity through genuine skill. His reconnaissance work had been essential to Lee's planning at multiple points in the war. His cavalry screened the army's movements, gathered intelligence on enemy positions, and denied the same intelligence to Union commanders who were perpetually uncertain about where Lee's infantry actually was. By early June of 1863, Stuart's cavalry division, soon to be expanded into a full corps, was encamped around Brandy Station, preparing to screen the northern flank of Lee's army as it began the movement that would become the Gettysburg Campaign. Lee's strategic plan called for the Army of Northern Virginia to slip away from its positions opposite the Army of the Potomac, move north through the Shenandoah Valley, and cross into Pennsylvania before Union commanders fully grasped what was happening. Stuart's cavalry was the screen that would make this possible, the eyes and the shield that would keep Joseph Hooker blind to Lee's movements until it was too late to respond effectively. Stuart's command by this point in the war had grown into something closer to a small army of its own. 5 brigades drawn from Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and beyond, led by men whose names would carry weight throughout the rest of the conflict. Wade Hampton, a South Carolina planter and one of the wealthiest men in the antebellum South, commanded with a quiet, deliberate style that contrasted sharply with Stuart's flair. Fitzhugh Lee and Rooney Lee, both nephews and sons of Robert E. Lee respectively, held brigade commands that placed the Army's most famous family name directly into the heart of the mounted arm. These were men who had ridden together, fought together, and built a collective sense of superiority over their Union counterparts that had calcified, by 1863, into something close to an article of faith. On June 8, the day before the battle, Stuart staged a grand cavalry review for Lee and other dignitaries near Brandy Station. It was an enormous spectacle, thousands of horsemen arrayed in formation, sabers drawn, charging in mock assault across open fields while spectators watched from blankets and carriages, a kind of theatrical performance of Confederate martial glory. Newspapers covered it. Civilians attended. It was, by every account from those present, a magnificent show, and it was also, in retrospect, a moment of vulnerability that Stuart and his men had no idea was about to be exploited. Because on the other side of the Rappahannock, Joseph Hooker had become suspicious. Reports were accumulating that suggested unusual Confederate cavalry activity in the Culpeper area, activity that Hooker, reasonably, interpreted as a possible prelude to a raid against Union supply lines or perhaps even a movement north. He ordered his cavalry commander, Alfred Pleasonton, to cross the river, attack and disperse what federal intelligence believed to be Stuart's force, and determine what Lee's army was actually preparing to do. What Pleasonton's force found when it crossed the Rappahannock before dawn on June 9 was not what Union cavalry had grown accustomed to finding in prior engagements with Stuart's command. For 2 years of war, Confederate cavalry had operated with a level of dominance over their Union counterparts that had become almost an article of faith on both sides. Southern horsemen, drawn disproportionately from a rural culture built around riding and hunting from childhood, had consistently outperformed Union cavalry units assembled largely from urban and industrial populations with far less equestrian experience. Stuart's reputation rested substantially on this dynamic. Federal cavalry had been raided, screened against, and humiliated so consistently that the assumption of Confederate superiority had calcified into something close to doctrine. Pleasanton crossed the river at 2 points before sunrise, Buford's division at Beverly Ford to the north, Gregg's division at Kelly's Ford to the south, intending a coordinated pincer that would catch Stuart's camps by surprise and crush them before they could organize a coherent defense. The northern crossing achieved a near-total surprise. Confederate pickets near Beverly Ford were overrun before they could raise an effective alarm, and for a period of perhaps an hour, Stuart's command was in genuine danger of being caught completely unprepared, still recovering from the previous day's grand review, with men and horses not yet ready for combat. John Buford, commanding the Northern Federal column, would go on to earn lasting recognition for his judgment a month later, when his decision to dismount his cavalry and hold the ridges west of Gettysburg on the morning of July 1 bought the Union Army the time it needed to secure the high ground that decided the entire battle. At Brandy Station, Buford's division pushed south from Beverly Ford against increasingly organized Confederate resistance, fighting through terrain crossed by stone walls and fences that broke up the open cavalry charges both sides preferred and forced extended periods of dismounted combat, troopers firing carbines from behind cover in a style that anticipated the kind of fighting Buford's men would conduct again at Gettysburg itself. What happened across the next 16 hours has been studied by military historians as one of the most significant turning points in the Cavalry War, even though it produced no decisive battlefield outcome in the conventional sense. Confederate cavalry, despite the surprise of the initial Union crossing, rallied with a speed that prevented disaster. Stuart's subordinate commanders, particularly Wade Hampton and Rooney Lee, the son of Robert E. Lee, organized counterattacks that stabilized the Confederate position near Fleetwood Hill, the high ground that would become the battle's central contested point and would change hands multiple times over the course of the day. The fighting that followed bore almost no resemblance to the cavalry actions most people associate with the Civil War: quick raids, skirmishes, screening actions fought mostly at a distance with carbines and occasional artillery support. Brandy Station became, for substantial stretches of the day, a battle fought with sabers at close range, thousands of mounted men colliding directly into each other in formations that more closely resembled European cavalry warfare from an earlier century than anything typically associated with American Civil War combat. Survivors described chaos on a scale that exceeded anything in their prior experience. Dust clouds so thick that men could not identify friend from enemy at 10 yards, the sound of steel against steel mixed with gunfire and the screaming of wounded horses, charges and countercharges across the same ground repeated so many times that by afternoon the grass had been ground into churned mud regardless of the dry June weather. Fleetwood Hill itself changed hands several times during the engagement, each exchange measured in a few hundred yards of advance and retreat purchased with substantial casualties on both sides. Union cavalry, fighting with a cohesion and aggression that surprised Confederate veterans who had grown accustomed to easy dominance, held their ground against Stuart's counterattacks for hours rather than breaking and scattering as prior engagements had conditioned both sides to expect. Gregg's division, advancing from the south, very nearly succeeded in capturing Stuart's own headquarters atop Fleetwood Hill before Confederate reinforcements arrived in time to prevent what would have been a catastrophic embarrassment led atop an already difficult day. The fighting carried a personal cost that went beyond the aggregate casualty figures. Wade Hampton's younger brother, Frank Hampton, colonel of the 2nd South Carolina Cavalry, was mortally wounded leading a charge near St. James Church and died within hours, one of several family tragedies the battle inflicted on officers who had spent the war fighting alongside relatives and childhood friends. Colonel Solomon Williams of the 2nd North Carolina Cavalry was killed in the same general fighting, struck while attempting to rally his regiment during one of the many confused, close-range collisions that defined the day. These were not anonymous losses absorbed into a casualty report and forgotten. They were losses felt immediately and personally within a cavalry corps small enough that nearly every officer knew nearly every other officer by name and reputation. By evening, Pleasanton withdrew his Federal cavalry back across the Rappahannock, having accomplished his reconnaissance objective, confirming the presence of substantial Confederate infantry in the Culpeper area, evidence that supported Hooker's suspicion that Lee was preparing some kind of major movement, but without having destroyed or seriously crippled Stuart's command, which remained intact and in possession of the field when the fighting ended. By the traditional measure used to assign victory in 19th-century battles, who held the ground when the guns fell silent, Brandy Station was a Confederate victory, and Stuart claimed it as one. The intelligence Pleasanton carried back across the river moved quickly up the Union chain of command. Hooker forwarded his assessment to Washington within days, and the reports reaching Abraham Lincoln through June carried a tone of genuine uncertainty about Lee's ultimate destination, uncertainty that would persist for nearly 2 more weeks as Confederate infantry columns wound their way north through the Shenandoah Valley, screened from clear observation by the very mountains that made the valley such an effective invasion corridor in the first place. What Brandy Station provided was not certainty about where Lee was going. It was confirmation that he was going somewhere in force, which was itself enough to set the Army of the Potomac in motion on a parallel northward track that would eventually place it in position to contest Pennsylvania rather than Washington or Baltimore. But the traditional measure missed almost everything that actually mattered about what had happened that day. Confederate cavalry had been surprised in their camps by a Union force that managed to cross a defended river line at 2 separate points with enough coordination to nearly catch Stuart's command completely unprepared. They had been pushed off contested ground multiple times during the fighting rather than simply dominating from the outset, as prior engagements had conditioned everyone to expect. Federal horsemen had fought with a discipline and aggression in sustained close combat that Confederate veterans, including officers who had fought against Union cavalry in a dozen prior engagements, found genuinely unsettling. And Stuart's own headquarters had come within a remarkably narrow margin of capture, an outcome that would have represented a humiliation of an entirely different magnitude than anything the war had yet produced for Confederate cavalry. The casualty figures, while not enormous by the standards of the infantry battles that would follow at Gettysburg, were nonetheless significant for a cavalry engagement, somewhere in the range of 900 Confederate casualties and just under 900 Union casualties, figures close enough to each other that neither side could claim a decisive tactical advantage in the exchange itself. What separated the two sides was not the casualty count. It was what each side took away from the experience. For Union cavalry, Brandy Station became something close to a foundational moment of self-belief. For 2 years they had operated under the psychological weight of Confederate cavalry superiority, an assumption so deeply embedded that it shaped tactical decisions before engagements even began. Brandy Station broke that assumption, not by producing a clean Union victory, but simply by proving that Federal cavalry could meet Stuart's command on equal terms and hold their own through an entire day of the hardest fighting either side had yet experienced in the mounted war. That psychological shift mattered enormously for what followed. The Union cavalry that fought at Gettysburg 3 weeks later, that screened Meade's army, that fought the delaying actions north of town on July 1st, that clashed with Stuart's own command again in the climactic cavalry engagement east of Gettysburg on July 3 while Pickett's infantry was being destroyed at the angle, was a fundamentally more confident force than the one that had crossed the Rappahannock before dawn on June 9. Brandy Station is where that transformation began. For the Confederacy, and for Stuart personally, the consequences ran in the opposite direction, and they ran deep. Southern newspapers, accustomed to reporting Stuart's exploits in the celebratory tone that had defined coverage of his prior campaigns, published unusually pointed criticism in the days following the battle. Some questioned how Confederate cavalry, supposedly the finest mounted force in the war, had allowed itself to be surprised so thoroughly in its own camps. Others suggested, more cuttingly, that the elaborate grand review staged the day before the battle reflected a commander more interested in spectacle and personal glory than in the unglamorous discipline of picket duty and reconnaissance that might have prevented the surprise in the first place. The criticism stung Stuart in a way that battlefield losses against larger, better-equipped infantry forces never had, because it attacked something central to his self-conception, the idea that he was simply, inherently, better at this than anyone the Union could field against him. That wound to Stuart's pride and reputation did not stay contained within the aftermath of Brandy Station. It followed him directly into the Gettysburg Campaign that began just days later, and it shaped one of the most consequential and controversial decisions of the entire war. When Lee's army began its movement north through the Shenandoah Valley in mid-June, Stuart was given orders that, in their broad strokes, called for his cavalry to screen the army's movement and maintain contact with Lee's main force while gathering intelligence on Union army movements. The orders contained enough discretionary latitude, as Lee's orders to trusted subordinates often did, that Stuart had room to interpret how exactly he would accomplish that mission. What Stuart chose to do was launch an ambitious ride around the entire Union army, a maneuver reminiscent of his earlier celebrated rides around McClellan, one that would take his cavalry corps on a long arc east and then north before swinging back to rejoin Lee's main force somewhere in Pennsylvania. Whether this decision was driven by sound tactical reasoning, by a desire to replicate past glories, or by an unconscious need to redeem the reputation that had been damaged at Brandy Station has been argued by historians for over a century, and the honest answer is probably some combination of all three motivations operating simultaneously in a proud man who had just been publicly criticized for the first time in his career. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Stuart's ride took far longer than anticipated, complicated by unexpected Union troop movements that forced detours, by a captured Federal wagon train that Stuart insisted on bringing along despite the burden it placed on his column's speed, and by fighting along the way that further slowed his progress. The result was that Stuart's cavalry, the eyes and ears that Lee depended upon for intelligence about Union Army positions and movements, was effectively absent from the Army of Northern Virginia for the most critical days of the entire campaign, including the period when Lee's scattered corps were converging on Gettysburg without clear knowledge of exactly where the Army of the Potomac actually was. Lee, deprived of the reconnaissance capability that had served him so effectively in prior campaigns, was forced to make critical decisions about concentrating his army with significantly less information than he had grown accustomed to operating with. Stuart did not rejoin the main Confederate force until the afternoon of July 2, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg already underway, arriving to a reception from Lee that witnesses described as colder and more pointed than anything Stuart had previously experienced from a commander who had treated him almost like a favored son throughout the war. The direct causal line between Brandy Station and the outcome at Gettysburg is not simple, and any honest telling has to resist the temptation to draw it too cleanly. Stuart's ride around the Union Army was his own decision, made under his own authority within the discretion Lee's orders allowed him, and a great many factors beyond wounded pride contributed to how that decision unfolded and how badly it went. But the timeline and the psychology connecting the two events are difficult to dismiss entirely. A commander freshly stung by public criticism of his vigilance and his judgment, criticism that specifically accused him of prioritizing spectacle over substance, chose an audacious and glory-seeking maneuver at exactly the moment when caution and tight coordination with Lee's infantry would have served the Army's actual strategic needs far better. Whether or not Brandy Station directly caused the choice, it is difficult to imagine Stuart making precisely that decision, in precisely that way, absent the wound to his reputation that the battle on the Rappahannock had inflicted 11 days earlier. There is a broader dimension to Brandy Station that extends beyond Stuart's personal trajectory and into the larger strategic picture of the entire Gettysburg campaign. Hooker's primary objective in ordering Pleasanton's reconnaissance in force had been to determine what Lee's army was actually doing in the Culpeper area, and the battle accomplished exactly that. The presence of substantial Confederate infantry confirmed at Brandy Station told Hooker, and through him the Union High Command in Washington, that Lee was preparing a major movement rather than simply repositioning for defensive purposes. That confirmation set in motion the chain of decisions that would eventually see the Army of the Potomac shadowing Lee's advance northward, staying between the Confederate Army and Washington, and ultimately arriving in position to intercept Lee's forces in Pennsylvania rather than being caught completely unprepared by a Confederate army that had slipped past undetected. Brandy Station was, in this sense, the moment the Gettysburg Campaign actually became visible to Union commanders as the major operation it was, the moment the fog around Lee's intentions began to lift, weeks before the armies actually collided at Gettysburg itself. Imagine, for a moment, the counterfactual in which Pleasanton's crossing on June 9 never happens, or happens with less aggression, producing only the kind of inconclusive skirmish that had characterized most prior cavalry encounters between the two armies. Without the intelligence Brandy Station provided, Hooker's awareness of Lee's northward movement would likely have been delayed, potentially by days that could have proven decisive in a campaign where timing determined which army reached favorable ground first and which was forced to fight on terrain not of its choosing. The Union Army's movement to intercept Lee might have begun later, with less certainty about Confederate intentions, potentially altering the entire sequence of events that placed Meade's army on the high ground at Gettysburg rather than somewhere less favorable, or altering the timing enough that the climactic battle might never have occurred in the specific place and the specific way that it did. This is what the word forgotten in the title of this battle is actually meant to capture, not that Brandy Station was unimportant, but that its importance operated through consequences and ripple effects rather than through the kind of singular, visually dramatic outcome that tends to dominate popular historical memory. There was no Pickett's charge at Brandy Station, no single moment of catastrophic, photogenic failure that lodges itself permanently in cultural memory. There was instead a long, grinding, chaotic day of mounted combat whose true significance only becomes visible when you trace its consequences forward through the following month, through Stuart's wounded pride, through his ill-fated ride, through Lee's diminished intelligence picture during the most critical days of troop concentration, through a more confident Union cavalry that performed differently at Gettysburg than it might have performed without the experience of having stood toe-to-toe with Stuart's vaunted command and not been broken by it. Military historians who specialize in the cavalry war have long argued that Brandy Station deserves recognition as one of the genuine turning points of the conflict, not because of what happened on the field that day in isolation, but because of how thoroughly it altered the psychological and operational dynamics that shaped everything that came after it. It marked the end of unquestioned Confederate cavalry dominance, a dominance that had been treated as a near-permanent fact of the war's mounted operations since virtually its opening engagements. It marked the beginning of a Union cavalry arm that would, by 1864, become genuinely superior to its Confederate counterpart, eventually fielding commanders like Philip Sheridan who would run roughshod over Confederate cavalry forces in ways that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the men who fought at Brandy Station in June of 1863. And it marked the specific moment when Jeb Stuart's judgment, previously trusted almost without question by Lee, began to be shadowed by a wound to pride that would influence one of the most consequential and second-guessed decisions any Confederate officer made during the entire Gettysburg Campaign. The decline that followed was not immediate, and Stuart himself remained a formidable commander for nearly another year after Brandy Station. But the trajectory had bent in a direction it had not bent before. By May of 1864, Sheridan's Federal Cavalry Corps would meet Stuart's command at Yellow Tavern, just north of Richmond, in an engagement that ended with Stuart himself mortally wounded, struck by a dismounted Union trooper during the kind of close, chaotic fighting that Brandy Station had previewed almost exactly a year earlier. The arc connecting those two battles is not a straight line of inevitable cause and effect, but it is a visible arc nonetheless, a Confederate cavalry arm that had once operated with unquestioned superiority, meeting its end against a Union-mounted force that had first proven it could stand and fight on the fields around Brandy Station, 11 days before Gettysburg, in a battle most people watching documentaries about the Civil War have never once heard mentioned. None of this is to suggest that Brandy Station alone determined the outcome at Gettysburg, or that history pivoted entirely on a single cavalry battle fought along the Rappahannock in the second week of June. War rarely operates through single causes that explain everything downstream of them, and any history that claims otherwise is usually oversimplifying for the sake of narrative convenience. But Brandy Station belongs in the category of events that genuinely altered the trajectory of what followed, shifting psychological assumptions on both sides, removing a Confederate intelligence asset from the field during the precise window when that asset was needed most, and providing Union commanders with the clarity about Lee's intentions that allowed the Army of the Potomac to position itself for the engagement that would follow. It did all of this while remaining almost entirely absent from the popular narrative of the Gettysburg Campaign, overshadowed by the scale and drama of what happened 3 weeks later in a Pennsylvania college town that has since become permanently fixed in American historical memory. The fields around Brandy Station look much like ordinary Virginia farmland today. Fleetwood Hill, the high ground that changed hands so many times during those 16 hours of fighting, has only in recent years received the kind of preservation attention that Gettysburg has enjoyed for well over a century, the land having spent decades in private agricultural use with little to mark what had occurred there. A preservation organization eventually purchased the core of Fleetwood Hill in the 2010s, removing a modern house that had been built directly atop the contested high ground and beginning the slow work of returning the site to something closer to its 1863 appearance. An effort that took place more than a century after similar work had already transformed Gettysburg into one of the most thoroughly preserved and interpreted landscapes in the country. Visitors who make the trip to Brandy Station today find none of the crowds, none of the extensive interpretive infrastructure, none of the cultural weight that surrounds the battlefield where the war's most famous 3 days unfolded. What they find instead is quiet ground, rolling and unremarkable to the eye, carrying within it the largest cavalry battle North America has ever witnessed, and carrying within it as well the opening chapter of a chain of consequences that ran forward, link by link, into the second and third days of fighting at Gettysburg itself. History remembers the battles that produced clean, dramatic, singular outcomes. It is far less reliable at remembering the battles whose true significance lies in what they set into motion rather than in what they immediately and visibly accomplished. Brandy Station belongs unmistakably to the second category, a battle that changed almost nothing about the map of Virginia on the evening of June 9, 1863, and changed almost everything about the campaign that would unfold across the following month, right up to the moment Pickett's men stepped off into the open ground in front of Cemetery Ridge, 3 weeks and one forgotten battle later. For this kind of history, always make sure you follow our handle, share, and like our work to support us.